the webinar on teaching with podcasts that support engagement and equitable learning. So thank you all very, very much for joining us today. I am Monica Brady-Meyerov. I am the founder and CEO of Listenwise. And I am also the author of a new book called Listenwise, Teach Students to be Better Listeners. And this book takes everything that I've learned in creating Listenwise for you to use with your students and puts it in an easy to reference book with class activities and personal anecdotes and stories. It also has some stories about when I was a reporter. Before I started Listenwise, I was creating audio as a reporter. And one lucky attendee will receive a free copy of my book at the end of the webinar. So please chat away and let me know your name in the chat box, as that's how I will be selecting it. So if you can say where you're from in the chat and maybe a little bit of something about why you're interested in listening, that would be awesome. So today in this session, you're going to learn how to use Listenwise as a culturally responsive teaching tool. And that's going to help you support your equity goals by engaging students with real-world podcasts, which are accompanied by standards-based teaching resources. So with the listening, you'll be able to build literacy skills using diverse multicultural content, and you'll also be able to focus on instructional equity using audio and storytelling as that lever, because we won't be leveling down the stories when students are listening. What we will be doing is giving them supports and scaffolding to help everybody listen and learn from the same story. And as I said, I'd love to take your questions throughout our conversation. First, I want to talk about the connection between listening and reading, because this is fundamentally why listening is such an important skill to develop in your students. Listening comprehension is a fundamental building block of reading comprehension development. The simple view of reading by Goff and Tumner suggests that reading is a function of two key components, decoding and language comprehension. And the differences in students' reading comprehension performance can largely be predicted by their decoding skills. So decoding and listening are necessary, but neither is sufficient alone for a student to be a good reader. And that's why I'm taking you back to this simple view of reading, because this is a webinar about listening, and we want to focus more on language comprehension and how listening plays into that. It's language comprehension is made up of listening and vocabulary, but it also plays a very important part in fluency. So listening while reading, especially like hearing the words and seeing them printed, as you just did on the story we were playing before the webinar began, it really helps students recognize sounds and letters, learn new words, become better listeners, and understand how stories work. And if you're an English language learner teacher, as I can see many of you are from the chat box, it's especially key for helping students be better, hear authentically spoken language. Now, you may think that as students grow older, they don't need to, they've learned how to read and they don't need listening as much as when they're younger and they're in elementary grades learning to read. But actually, as students grow older, the relative importance of listening comprehension increases, because it takes until middle school to reach the point where reading comprehension outpaces listening comprehension. One study shows that as students get older, problems with reading comprehension emerge. And this provides an opportunity for you to give content that is auditory, and that can help close the content gap. Because when you're listening, students can understand texts at a higher grade level than they can read. I'm going to say that again. This is true for general education students as well as English learners, that students can understand texts when listening at a higher level than when they are reading, in part because their receptive vocabularies are typically higher than their expressive vocabularies. That's why it's important to focus on students' listening skills well beyond the years of direct reading instruction. And it's also why I want to stress that the importance that reading alone is not enough. So it's not paying attention to this important component of reading, listening. You're really missing out on an opportunity, because when you are reading and listening, it increases accuracy by 52%. It improves comprehension. Pairing reading with text is a powerful solution, not only for reading, but for language learning. Reading fluency can be developed through a process called assisted reading. So students read a passage while simultaneously listening to it. And there was a study of third graders using a reading while listening app showing improvement over their control group. And the study showed a significant word count per minute improvement in the treatment group compared to the control group. So listening while reading helps kids, as I said, recognize sounds and letters, understand how stories work, hear things authentically spoken and spelled, and this all helps improve comprehension. Research also illustrates that instructional materials, assignments, and texts that reflect students' backgrounds and experiences are critical to engagement and deep, meaningful learning. Podcast stories that I'm going to be sharing with you represent diversity of races, ethnicities, cultures, religions, classes, disabilities, gender, and sexual identities. So providing these diverse, multicultural podcast content as instructional texts really opens the door for you to let students really hear themselves reflected in what they are learning. And these windows promote understanding of these diverse perspectives, and their mirrors can validate who they are. So I was playing one at the beginning of the webinar for those of you who joined a little early, but I'm going to go back now to Listenwise so you can see how many different stories we have in terms of types of stories. We're looking now at our current events collection, which is filled with newsy stories and also some that are fun to listen to and have historical relevance. But I'm going to bring up a couple that particularly speak to this issue of diverse perspectives. So one is about a young cancer survivor who has gone into space. Uh-oh. I spelled something wrong. Let me just see if I can, there we go. This is a really cool story about a former cancer patient who's scheduled to become the first person in space with an artificial limb. This person lost their leg to cancer, and now she's a physician's assistant heading into orbit. Really exciting to feel like, you know, she has a disability, but that hasn't held her back. And in this story, you hear her dream coming true. I'm just going to play the first minute or less of it so you can just hear in her own words her excitement about what's happened.
Some kids dream of being athletes or actors or astronauts. Well, when she was 11 years old, Haley Arsenault dreamed of working at the hospital that helped her beat childhood bone cancer. Here she is speaking at the Louisiana Young Heroes Gala in 2003.
Children want to see their dreams. I know I did, and I know I'm going to.
And what are your dreams? What do you dream about?
I want to be a nurse at St. Jude.
Nearly 2 decades later, she has become a physician's assistant at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. And as a bonus, she's also about to be an astronaut. Haley Arsenault was recently selected to join SpaceX's Inspiration 4. It's the first.
So pretty cool story, you know, to hear in that child's voice what her dream was and how she achieved it. It can be very inspirational for students to hear that. And we have so many stories like that. The one I was just sharing before the webinar started about March Madness and the women's equity gap, that was a great story too about how women athletes aren't treated fairly. And this is something a lot of your students could identify with. So we bring these voices that are often underrepresented and really showcase them in a way that's unique because of the audio. You're often hearing from the first person who is being featured in the story. So I'll come back and play you some other stories in a moment, but first I want to talk a little bit more about how to teach with podcasts. And want to tell you that podcasts can support a variety of your instructional goals using nonfiction audio stories like the news that we have on Listenwise. They're all 3 to 5 minutes long, nonfiction taken from sources that are reputable news sources, and it helps them connect their learning to the world around them. These stories are about engaging topics like herd immunity and how to achieve that with the coronavirus, about Asian Americans' experience of prejudice, things that are happening right now. We update our current events every school day. And you can also, that allows you to discuss contemporary issues. It also allows you to build a lot of academic language for ELs. This is, and I'm going to go into this a little more deeply. And then if you're from one of the 22 states that test listening in the SBAC or in Florida, that's also tested on their state test, it's a great way to practice your students' listening skills. And I'll show you our quizzing mechanism that allows you to assign a listening story and allow students to practice it on their own, taking a multiple choice auto-scored quiz. Well, we're going to focus now on the 5 key practices to use listening. These are all research-based, proven practices that can be used with all students, and we'll call out some specific practices that are especially good for ELs. First, pre-teaching vocabulary. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, but it assists in building and accessing prior knowledge. It familiarizes students with what they're about to hear, and if done thoughtfully, it can really hook students into the learning. But first, you always want to prioritize what are the words or phrases to choose that you're going to pre-teach. And then what tiers are they in? On Listenwise, and I'll show you this in a little bit as well, we do offer tiered vocabulary pulled out of the story. So we've done the work for you in helping you identify some key words in the story. Now, in the process of pre-teaching, you always want to remember too to do it in the context. Perhaps you need visuals or movements or bilingual dictionaries to help. That can always be very helpful for English learners. It also helps to have regular routines with English learners, playing games with the words, saying things about the words, just helping people get access to all of the things, all of the words that may trip them up when they listen to the story. Academic language is more than vocabulary, as we know. It's about grammar and syntax. And if you look at the difference between these two, the slide here references that language can convey nuances of meaning. And as they expand language, students can say or do more with the content as well. So academic language has so many intricate parts. When paired with the functions for language, there's a lot of explicit instructions that teachers must attend to when they're teaching. And this just helps kind of identify that a little further. Now I'd like you to hear this in practice on Listenwise. So I'm going to go back over and I'm going to choose one of our weird news stories. These are very short, 30-second long stories. We post a new one every week. We have hundreds on already, and they are really meant to focus on vocabulary. In 30 seconds, there's a lot of things you can do with the story, but what we suggest is focusing on this vocabulary. And in fact, there's even more than that in this story. There's familiar, traveled, resident, recently, lounging, reunited, and current, all in 30 seconds. But listen to the story closely, and then we're going to go to the assignment resources and look at the listening comprehension and discussion theme questions.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Martin. Sometimes all you want is a familiar front porch. Maybe that's what was going through the mind of a yellow lab named Cleo when she traveled 60 miles to her family's old house in Lawson, Missouri. They moved out in 2018. The new residents recently came home to find Cleo lounging on the porch. She's since been reunited with her family at their current address. No one knows how she traveled those 60 miles, but it must be a really great front porch.
All right, first I want to make sure you all heard that. I am seeing in the chat some people are not able to hear it. I do have on my share audio sound. Okay, good. I'm getting some feedback that you should check your audio settings in case you can't hear it. Most of us can. So there you go, 30 seconds, a fun story about a dog who finds his way back to his home porch. And then here are the questions for you to focus on that vocabulary. So if you had previewed the vocabulary, you would have discussed what a resident is, what does it mean to lounge? Maybe you just want to show them how to lounge about, maybe talk about their dogs. Do their dogs lounge? What do their dogs look like when they lounge? And then when you come to the questions afterwards, why were the residents of the dog's old house surprised to find her lounging on their porch? There's 2 of those vocabulary words right in that question. How long had it been since the dog's family moved out of their old residence? This is also another great teaching point, to be using the stem of the word in 2 different ways. They're residents and residents. So for ELs, this is particularly hard, I'm sure, to hear and understand, but being able to see it and hear it in the story. And then it's a 30-second long story. It's so easy. Play it again. And then there's a way to extend that. Why do you think the dog traveled so far to lounge on a porch? And how do you think she got there? It's a great way to engage students in their imaginations with it. The other way I've heard English learner teachers use this story is a scaffolded retell. So they'll listen once and they'll have students write down some of the main ideas. They'll listen again, writing down some details, and then they will do a turn and talk and tell the story to their pair. And what's great, because we have so many different of these weird news stories, you could have kids silently listening to each of their weird news stories and doing this activity and turning and talking and telling their mates, their seat mates or their classmates, what it is they learned from this story. So just a really fun way to practice vocabulary in an intentional way. Okay, I'm going to hop back to the presentation and moving on to number 2, building background knowledge. So, and also activating prior knowledge. This is a key feature. We have it in all of our lessons. And this is one of the example that we would suggest that you can use before playing a story. It's an anticipation guide. So before listening, read the statement and write a true false. And we have a list of statements that they can think about. What did they think before listening? What do they think after listening? So linking concepts to kids' backgrounds helps them see where it fits in their learning. Connecting the new to the past, beyond saying things like, who can remind me what we talked about yesterday? But instead using something like, here are some questions that will remind us of what we've been studying and where we were going next. And then also helping them fill in the gaps. What does today's learning include for which students might have holes in their knowledge base? And then thinking about, how can I build enough of a context to ready my students for learning? So this anticipation guide is used as a comprehension strategy before and after listening to a podcast. Prior to listening, students review several statements, and then they make predictions whether the statements are true or false. And students then listen and return back to their statements. So this is a great activity to use with your students. What I want to share now is a short video from one of our partner teachers at Listenwise. She is a teacher in Connecticut, 6th grade teacher in Connecticut, geography, Laura Krennicke, and she is talking about a pre-listening strategy that she does with her 6th grade social studies unit on sub-Saharan Africa. And she said she thought about how her middle school students are interested in movies and Marvel comics. So she used a story on Listenwise to get them ready for a unit she was about to teach on sub-Saharan Africa. So let's listen to her.
Yeah, this is actually probably an unusual way of going about this, but I use Listenwise often for for learning about another or about another subject or about our next unit that's coming up. And using this as a pre-listening strategy, we talk about this story about the Black Panther as part of a cultural geography unit that we do on sub-Saharan Africa. And so middle school students, I teach 6th grade, middle school students are all over movies and the Marvel comics. And so my intent for this story is twofold. One, it's really to capture their student interest. Just like those weird news stories, we want to capture their student interest in connecting with the geography of sub-Saharan Africa. And 2, we want to talk about why the story resonated with so many in breaking stereotypes. Now, I myself have not seen the movie, but I do know that that is part of the purpose behind the film. So even though students may not recognize what those two purposes are when we first start it, the story is only 2 minutes long. This Black Panther movie story is 2 minutes. And what we do is we set up a listening organizer for them to help them go through and listen to the story. We go through it a few times just to make sure they're getting all the language. And we'll use a very short listening organizer or a graphic organizer to capture their ideas as students are listening. And then we can go back and check for understanding and expound a little bit more on the story. So for example, one of the questions may even just be a true or false question. We'll ask before Black Panther. So just so you know, setting it up in the story, they talk about how people or the Black characters were portrayed in comic books before the story Black Panther was made. So we ask in there, before Black Panther, Black characters in comic books were portrayed as vampires or devilish. Is that true or false? And in the question actually combines two things that the speaker says in the story. And it summarizes how those Black characters had been represented before the franchise. And then that would then lead to a discussion. Okay, so how were characters or how were heroes previously portrayed? And why is this story different? Yeah, this is actually probably an unusual way of going about this, but I use Listenwise often for for learning about another content or about another subject or about our next unit that's coming up. And using this as a pre-listening strategy, we talk about this story about the Black Panther as part of a cultural geography unit that we do on sub-Saharan Africa. And so middle school students, I teach sixth grade, middle school students are all over movies and the Marvel comics. And so my intent for this story is twofold. One, it's really to capture the student interest, just like those weird news stories. We want to capture.
Okay, sorry, I think I might have touched it and started it again, but I think we've got the gist of what she's saying. She is using Listenwise as a way to build knowledge for her students, and that's an excellent way to do it because there's so much content in these stories, and they can build excitement and interest. And it really leads to our next point, which is how we can build language and content together. This is the third key practice, because using listening to teach language and content together is something that's recommended by WIDA if you're in a WIDA state, because it's an excellent way to build content knowledge. It's a key factor in reading success. We know that background knowledge and content knowledge is really key to reading. This is especially important to English language learners. Stanford professor Jeffrey Zweers says there's a danger of over focusing on individual words. And when this happens, the connection with in-depth understanding of concepts and practice gets pushed aside. So students thinking about how to work on communicating ideas, not just focusing on language alone. His point is to bring the two together. And WIDA, which recently updated their standards, is inviting us all to renew our commitment to teaching that academic language for success in the content areas, and that we should teach it for success in the content areas and do so in ways that include and amplify the many languages and experiences of our students. And Listenwise can really help you do that with our collection, as I've shared with you some of the dynamic and interesting, diverse stories that we have on Listenwise. So the next area, in terms about that I want to focus on teaching this language and content together, is a story from Listenwise that require more scaffolding and support for language. For example, this story about the development of Homeland Security involves 5 different speakers and language that may not be familiar. You can look at the tier 3 words and tier 3 idioms, especially the idioms. So some pre-teaching is needed for helping them getting ready to understand what Homeland Security is, making sure they understand what 9/11 is, and then including different forms of some of the vocabulary words like resiliency, resilient, resilience, also words like bureaucracy. Students can define vocabulary terms using the context from the audio story when they don't understand it. And then in the end, they can also state their opinion and support it from evidence from the audio story. But I'm actually going to go to this story as well, because what I like about this story, what this story identifies, or I think really, hold on, it's always hard to talk and type. What I think this story demonstrates, there we go, is the way that in just a short amount of time, how much vocabulary can be covered and how many idioms might be involved, that you could take apart just the first minute and a half of this story and spend a lot of time on it. I also want to point out a few more things. This is a lesson on Listenwise, and it has a lot more resources. It has a Lexile audio measure of 1400, which I'm going to explain in just a little bit. This measures the complexity of the audio passage, gives you some instructional ideas there about what grade levels are good for it. It also has a quiz, and you can create an assignment. And all of this is accessible to be reviewed down here. So the assignment resources have these listening comprehension questions, theme questions, and then the vocabulary, as I told you that we have for every lesson here, the tiered vocabulary. So we have helped you to pull out what are the important words that you should be previewing with your students. We also have a variety of organizers that you can print out or assign online. Again, these are note-taking strategies. These are good sometimes for background. They are good for EL organizers if they have this little staircase on them for scaffolding. Sometimes they're good for just tracking and following along, like getting that metacognition of listening going. That, if you lose track of the story, you come back and you look at this language identification sheet and check off the boxes when you hear what's said. So these are all excellent comprehension strategies. Then the teacher's guide has how to assign suggested ways to teach the story, how to assign it up here. All of these assignment resources can be done in this create an assignment button. It's a quick 5-step process to create an assignment on Listenwise. And then this has additional scaffolding. Many of our stories do. You want to look for this little icon for additional EL scaffolding. What this does is simplify the listening comprehension questions, has the tiered vocabulary, and then goes into this close listening with language practice. It gets to some of the more language-based education points you can be teaching with this story. And it goes deeper into how to make connections when you're building background. It also has this close listening guide. I touched on this earlier when I talked about the way to retell the weird news story, but it's about listening several times for different purposes. Just as you would suggest a student read a text for different purposes and meaning, you can do the same for listening. And on our lessons that have scaffolding for ELs, this close listening section has a lot of great suggestions, and many times it even has points to stop and have conversations with your student. And finally, it has the multiple choice auto-scored quiz, which you can review here and look at the main idea, inferencing, vocabulary, and then you can assign it right up here. But what I want to do right now is just go back and play you the first few minutes of this story. And actually, I'm going to jump ahead, and because I want you to hear how many idioms there are in just this short segment I'm going to play you.
One of the first
In its early days, the Department of Homeland Security was something of a makeshift affair. The first secretary, Tom Ridge, operated out of a double cubicle, a bit more modest workspace than most of his fellow cabinet officers. The different agencies' computers couldn't talk to one another, and there were the inevitable turf wars. Current Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano gives her predecessors, Ridge and Michael Chertoff, a lot of credit for getting the thing going.
I think that Secretary Ridge and Chertoff did yeoman's work in getting the department up off its feet. It's the kind of department that you have to build the plane while you fly it. And I think that it has really begun to gel in important ways.
So I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 idioms in that 30-40 second clip. Makeshift, turf wars, build the plane while you fly it, gel. These are really important phrases and words and vocabulary to teach to students and can be very hard to come by. So using a story like this to teach those idioms is very powerful. It's also a great way to learn about Homeland Security, whether you're building background for another unit that you're about to start, as Laura shared with us in her example, or you are wrapping up a unit on 9/11 and want to talk about how 9/11 changed our safety landscape. All right, so I'm going to go back to the presentation, because the other way that when you're working on building content knowledge you can check is with the quiz. And I showed you briefly where they are on Listenwise, but this is a great way to check for content understanding with a multiple choice quiz. These are modeled after the SBAC. Remember, 22 states test listening, so it's possible your state is one of them, and your students could be facing these listening tests. And if you're an EL teacher, which I know many of you are, thank you for putting your information in the chat box. They're going to be tested on listening every year too. It's going to be on the WIDA access test if you're in a WIDA state, or some other lesson or some other test that is for classification, and really helping them prepare to practice their listening muscle, because really listening is a skill that can be improved, and it does not improve just by listening more. It improves by doing these practice listening activities with goals for listening, such as the quiz presents. This is an example of a main idea question. I'm sorry, it's critical listening. It's focusing on critical listening, asking what is the main idea of the story, and giving students the opportunity to express what they know. And then what's great about our quiz is that when a student completes it, they immediately see the results, including the correct answers. So they can see where they tripped up and why. And you could also reset the quiz and have them take it again. But you can also view and review and analyze the results from your teacher dashboard. That's what it looks like here. You know, our quizzes have identified eight strands of listening, eight skills that are involved in listening. But there are 4 key skills that we focus on in every quiz. And that is understanding the literal meaning, the main idea, vocabulary, and inferencing. And our quiz dashboard will give you the information you need to understand where your students are individually as well as the whole class. All right, let's go on to scaffolding. This is the next key practice in using listening, and it's good for struggling readers and English learners. Scaffolds are the way our students make sense of what they're learning. These are the practice tools where kids can take risks to out their thinking, and that they are, when they're used flexibly, they can add to what the students, how the students can take notes and understand what they're learning. So a couple of that I've listed here. The read-along transcript is what I've just been demonstrating to you on listening, on Listenwise. Comprehend, think alouds, also model how the language is used for success in the content. You can model and then have your kids model for each other too. Retelling focuses on parts of the process as experts, can help students be more clear and complete with their language that they want to convey. Imagine having 5 students retell a Listenwise story aloud, but each of them retelling just one part of it in detail. That would be a great exercise. You could use it on that Homeland Security story, for instance. And scaffolds can be planned for before, during, and after listening as routines that you can either do together or independently. So I want to say too that Listenwise is wonderful for group instruction or individual instruction. As you can see in this photo, students are listening on their own with headphones, and that might be the way you more commonly think of listening to audio, that it's sort of a private experience that you put in your headphones and you're absorbing it alone. But in fact, playing audio together for a group, research shows builds empathy. And that's an amazing thing to do in your classroom. So if you're all listening to a story together, you're going to be building empathy and learning content together. And I'm going to play you a story for that in just a little bit. So we've already looked at the scaffolding on Listenwise with the audio transcript that moves along in sync with the audio. You can also slow it down by 20%, and you can jump anywhere in the audio or in the transcript, and it stays synchronized. I should say that you can go on to listenwise.com now if you haven't already and get yourself an account on Listenwise. It is free for teachers, and we give you the opportunity to get a 30-day free trial of Premium that gives you all these scaffolds and supports. And you can also get a free trial for your school if you invite several other teachers, and that trial is a little longer than you would get individually as a teacher. So I encourage you, if you haven't done so already, sign up at listenwise.com. So the exciting thing that's happened in listening in the last year and a half is that Lexile, the makers of the Lexile reading framework, have created a new framework for listening. And we've been their partners in this in order to advance literacy, because we believe that listening is the missing piece of the literacy puzzle. And if you reflect back on the simple view of reading, it's such a key component of reading. And yet not often taught in beyond the early grades. And in fact, as a skill, it's very rarely focused on. And one of the reasons why it's been hard to focus on listening is because we haven't had a scientific scale to measure the audio and to measure a student's listening ability. So the new Lexile framework for listening allows us to do that. And it tells us the difficulty of an audio passage, and thus helps you make the right choice for each student. So it's on a Lexile scale similar to the one used for reading. And every single Listenwise story, as you saw probably in the upper right-hand corner, has this Lexile level. And it can be used, what it does is it assesses the language complexity, the vocabulary, the pacing of the speech, and then it puts it on the scale. And then actually, it's probably better to just show you this too. Because when you look at the Lexile level on our website over here, 840, you want to hover over this question mark and tap on it, because this will also help you understand where 840 falls. So this story falls between, that would be good for second to third grade listeners. Now the content is different. You may decide you're not teaching a unit on refugees in your second grade, so you don't need that. But if you have high school students who have lower language levels, and you think they're probably more along this, that their English is down in the second, third, fourth grade range, then this would be an excellent story to share. You're also able to search for these levels on our site by just clicking low, medium, or high, or sliding this bar so that you can choose a level. The Lexile measures in listening do not have a one-to-one correlation with reading Lexile levels. But if I'm introducing a new topic to students, I will aim for a lower Lexile listening level so that the key ideas are introduced without high-level vocabulary. However, if students are researching a topic on their own choosing, and they have some content knowledge, I let them choose from higher listening levels to push their understanding, so they can choose the stories themselves as well. So that is the Lexile listening level. Finally, the fifth key practice for listening is speaking. Encouraging speaking practice to deepen listening comprehension is so important. Stanford professor Jeff Zweers, his current work is deeply focused on coaching teachers and students to have fully engaging academic conversations across content areas. These can be informal check-ins like turn-in talks throughout class, or they could be group debates on topics. Zweers and his colleagues have strategies for both teachers and students to determine the topics to discuss, the language to grow authentic conversation, and the scaffolds to teach the ideas, and also some routines for assessing them. So you can go to his website at Stanford to learn a little bit more. I just wanted to give him a shout out because he's got so many great ideas about how to help students, EL students, with academic language and conversations. One of the ways he suggests using Listenwise is with what he called a scaffolded retell, it was called a think, pair, share ×3. So the idea is you listen to a story on Listenwise. Again, I might recommend a 30-second weird news story, and you have students turn and talk and explain what the story was to each other. But the idea is that each student is allowed to and encouraged to take something of what they heard from another student to then turn to the other side of their classroom and share using what they learned, building on what they learned, maybe using another point in their vocabulary word, another perspective, and sharing it with the next person, and then turning to a third student and doing it one more time. And that helps build academic conversation skills with students. Debates also spark conversations. So asking a question, presenting a story as a debate is just a great way to get going. And Listenwise has debates every Friday. And I'm going to go back and show you a few of them on our current events collection. Very easy to find stories that kids are going to want to talk about. Here's a great one just from last Friday. Debate: is in-person schooling essential? This talks about teachers, whether teachers are essential workers, and schools should be made as safe as possible, but there's some degree of risk that will likely exist. So learning about this controversy is what the story presents. So it's a 4-minute story. And what we'd suggest you do is have the students listen to it, maybe divide them into pros and cons, and get ready for a spoken debate afterwards, or maybe it's a written debate. One way you could assign the written debate is a quick create assignment. Because it is, this can be pushed out to all your students at once. And what I would recommend doing is taking out the listening comprehension questions and really just focusing on this debate question. I'll say back up with evidence in the story. Then it's ready to assign. And this way you are presenting your students with the content they need to be ready to make this debate in written. Actually, I have to make it do to have them have a written assignment about their debate. All right, so circling back to this idea before we wrap up, and I'm happy to take any questions should you want to put them in the chat, is that we know the pandemic has created challenges for many students, and it's really deepened disparities for some as a result of the school closures. So given the disruptions to learning that the challenges of COVID-19 has presented, Listenwise is a great way to provide that extra support to help all students stay on track, engaged, ready to readjust in the post-pandemic world in the fall. Because we have these easy to use, high quality lessons. The stories are equipped to meet the needs of diverse populations. We know many districts are prioritizing joy as well and preparing to deliver equitable access. I love the Weird News. I can't say enough about them. They bring a lot of joy. They spark a lot of fun. And we're going to be actually having, for if you're in a district that is more focused on building social and emotional connection and wellness and discussions, we've got an upcoming webinar a week from Thursday on May 13th that you can check out, and you should also sign up to attend that one so that you can learn more about how Listenwise can also meet your SEL DEI needs. And I also want to just tell you that we have this amazing opportunity to win Listenwise in a grant for the whole summer. You have to apply to it by May 10th, and we are going to be sending an email following up with this webinar, giving you information as to how to do that. And you can also sign up for a free trial of Premium for your school, as I mentioned, and RSVP for other webinars that we have in May. Let me see, are there any questions? I hope that you've learned a lot about how using audio can build engagement and be an equitable way to learn, because listening is an equalizer. Everyone is listening to the same story and provided the scaffolds needed for success. So happy to take any questions if you have them. And if you don't, I'm going to do an electronic name poll here around selecting who wins a copy of my book, Listenwise, Teach Students to be Better Listeners. Okay, the winner is Grace Ann Foga. Sorry, Grace Ann, if I have not pronounced your name correctly. Grace Ann Foga, you will receive a copy of my book, Listenwise, Teach Students to be Better Listeners. Should I have it right here? If I could send it through the internet, I would, but I'm unable to do that. And we'll email you and get the address to send you that book. Yeah, any questions that I can answer for you? Thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate you spending some time with us and thinking deeply about how listening can improve your students' reading and improve their academic outcomes. And I hope that you'll check out Listenwise so we can help you do that.